Welcome to Voices, LGBTQ plus conversations at the library. Today, we'll be hearing from Kate McNeely with Georgia Asylum and Immigration Network, who will be talking about the intersection of immigrant survivors and LGBTQ plus individuals.
I am honored to be speaking with you today. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I will be talking about legal services today, but this is not intended to be legal advice. My name is Kate McNeely, and I work at Georgia Asylum and Immigration Network, also known as GAIN. We are a nonprofit with a mission to protect and empower immigrant survivors of crime and persecution. That means we work with asylum seekers and immigrant survivors of human trafficking, domestic violence, sexual assault, and other crimes. We do this because in Georgia, where we have the toughest immigration courts in the nation, we believe that immigrant survivors deserve a more even playing field. And we know that providing legal representation, support services, and crisis intervention will all increase their chances of success. GAIN is not exclusively an LGBTQIA plus serving organization. Like many, I didn't realize the work that GAIN does with LGBTQIA plus individuals when I first came to work here. However, we are uniquely positioned to educate about the intersection of these issues. This is one of many culturally specific communities that we strive to serve with cultural responsiveness and compassion. I am also a queer woman, and my connection to the LGBTQIA plus survivors we serve who are seeking refuge is personal. I had the privilege of coming out in a family that accepted me, and in a country which, while we have much further to go, would not threaten my safety by state-sanctioned violence. Many in our global community do not have what I had, and I believe that we have the opportunity and the duty to assist our neighbors when we can. I also think it's important that we acknowledge that this presentation is specific to LGBTQIA plus immigrant survivors. As a community, we experience so much reduction of our stories, what I call the agony and the ecstasy of queer and gender nonconforming identities. We see rainbow capitalism. We see LGBTQIA plus identities used as entertainment, or we see narratives that focus only on the difficult moments, like coming out in an unwelcoming environment, facing discrimination, and of course, violence. We're going to talk a lot about the latter today, but I want to make it clear that happy LGBTQIA plus immigrants exist and thrive all over the U.S. First, a quick note about one particular group of people I will be discussing today, asylees and asylum seekers. Asylees meet the same UN definition as refugees, and the distinction between the two groups is procedural. Asylum seekers apply from within the U.S. or at a port of entry versus refugees who apply abroad. Asylum seekers do not access the same resettlement funds and programs until much later in the process, and they are an extremely vulnerable group. For some asylum seekers, their claim is based on their status as LGBTQIA plus individuals, but in order to understand that, I need to briefly explain the basics of asylum claims. Asylees are fleeing harm and persecution abroad, and for many, that persecution is directly related to who they are. They have been forced to flee their home country and are now internationally displaced. Like refugees, asylum seekers may fear returning home due to reasons related to their race, religion, ethnicity, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. For many, especially those applying at a port of entry or meeting the asylum process defensively, the first step in claiming asylum is a credible fear interview. In March 2021, the Williams Institute at UCLA School of Law put out a report titled LGBT Asylum Claims in the United States, which used data about fear claims made through the defensive process to estimate that 11,400 applications for asylum were filed in the United States on the basis of LGBT status between federal fiscal years 2012 and 2017. They also found that claimants originated from 84 countries, with over half from the Northern Triangle region of Central America and significant portions from Mexico and Ghana. ILGA World, the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association, publishes a state-sponsored homophobia report every year, which is a world survey of sexual orientation laws. they found that there are 69 UN member countries that have laws that criminalize consensual same-sex sexual acts between adults in private. And over 30 of these countries are enforcing the laws actively, resulting in sentences of jail, public flogging, or even death for gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, transgender, and gender norm-conforming people around the world. The report highlights instances of abuse. For example, in July 2020 in Algeria, 44 people were arrested and charged for allegedly organizing and participating in a same-sex wedding between two men. In Cameroon, between 2016 and 2018, there were nearly 1,800 reports of arrests, extortion, and violence against individuals by authorities based on their sexual orientation. At GAIN, we have served clients who have faced violence, exploitation, and even torture because of their identities. Also from ILGA World's report, we can see that there are protections in international human rights law to be free from sanction based on actual or perceived sexual orientation, sexual activity, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. But if you live in a country that is not following these principles, you may find yourself afraid and in danger. And that's one important reason we have seen LGBTQIA plus individuals seek asylum in the US. Another is abuse. Queer and trans individuals have come to GAIN because they were targeted as a result of their activism and advocacy for LGBTQIA plus rights, or because of who they are. Trans individuals, as we know, face truly devastating levels of abuse, something no person should have to endure, and issues such as domestic violence and abuse can rise to the level of qualifying an individual for asylum if the government in their home country is unwilling or unable to protect them, which can be due to issues like undue influence on the part of their abusers. The decision to leave your home country and seek refuge in the U.S. is not one that any of our clients take lightly. And yet, after arriving in the U.S., many asylum seekers struggle to access legal representation and/or fear disclosing their identity in order to provide support for their case. But abuse and assault do not only happen abroad. These are issues that affect our communities in the U.S. just as deeply. While the primary focus of my presentation is LGBTQIA+ immigrant survivors, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that this is deeply intersectional work. It can be difficult to measure the impact of these issues on people who are immigrants and survivors and LGBTQIA+. We do know a little bit about the impact of these types of violence on LGBTQIA+ communities, regardless of their immigration status or immigrant heritage. The CDC's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey last released their findings on victimization by sexual orientation in 2010. Please forgive some very gender binary-based language and narrow definitions of LGBTQIA+ identities ahead as I quote their report. Quote, sexual minority respondents reported levels of intimate partner violence at rates equal to or higher than those of heterosexuals. End quote. Let's also discuss bi-plus people who are attracted to two or more genders. The same report found that 61% of these people have experienced rape, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. In September 2021, Mashable put out an article called Why Bi People Are More Vulnerable to Partner Violence. And they said, the majority of LGBTQ Americans are bisexual, yet bi people face harmful stereotyping both in the queer community and society at large. These negative misbeliefs, such as that bi people are hypersexual, have been linked to instances of intimate partner violence. We also know that domestic violence is not limited to heterosexual partners. Because the majority of the intimate partner violence awareness movement has focused on heterosexual relationships, members of the LGBTQIA+ community have been largely left out of the movement, and leaving LGBTQIA+ survivors out of these conversations can lead to fewer interventions and fear of coming forward. That impact is compounded for immigrant survivors. Undocumented and immigrant survivors are vulnerable to the same forms of abuse as everyone else, but they also face unique forms of domestic abuse and intimate partner abuse, such as financial abuse and immigration abuse, in which the abuser withholds access to immigration processes or paperwork as an additional means of power and control over the individual. Many domestic violence shelters are specific to women only, and this can leave LGBTQIA plus men and trans folks with few places to turn. Immigrant survivors may also face cultural barriers to coming forward, as well as the fear that any interaction with the criminal justice system, even as a victim, could put them at risk for deportation, detention, or separation from their family in the U.S. And when we talk about additional barriers, we must acknowledge that all of these factors are further compounded for trans and gender nonconforming communities. In GAIN's Victims of Violence program, we serve immigrant survivors regardless of their gender identity or expression. Yet we know that transgender individuals face unique obstacles, including widespread mistreatment and violence, and are at higher risk of being targeted by abusers and traffickers. In fact, the 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey found that an overwhelming 68% of their undocumented respondents had faced intimate partner violence. We also know that undocumented transgender individuals are more likely to face severe economic hardship and violence, which are risk factors for victimization and further abuse. Thankfully, there are immigration remedies available for survivors of these crimes here in the U.S. Immigrant survivors are incredibly vulnerable, and yet we know that having immigration status in the U.S. can be a stabilizing force and even help break the cycle of abuse by giving the survivor more independence and the ability to support themselves through work authorization. There are several immigration remedies for survivors of abuse which we specialize in at GAIN. These include T visas for survivors of human trafficking, including sex trafficking and labor trafficking, U visas for survivors of crimes such as domestic violence, VAWA self-petitions, and please forgive the language of our government when I say battered spouse waivers, for survivors of abuse who are close relatives of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents. Remember the CDC data on sexual and intimate partner violence and sexual orientation? They also found that approximately 1/5 of lesbian and heterosexual women and 1/2 of bisexual women reported that they were concerned for their safety, and or they reported they had at least one post-traumatic stress disorder symptom. At GAIN, we see this every day. Nearly every client who walks through our doors has experienced trauma. When we refer them to receive medical and mental health evaluations, they are overwhelmingly diagnosed with PTSD and other effects of trauma, and they are made to pay the cost of their experiences in many ways, ranging from the personal to the societal and the economic. It is imperative that organizations who work with these communities adopt a trauma-informed approach. That begins with recognizing the impact of trauma on the individual, as well as the staff who work with them. It looks like mental health care. It looks like secondary traumatic stress education and the support systems to back it up. It looks like understanding, compassion, collaboration, empowerment, and being bold enough to rethink and rebuild the processes we have in place and how they might be received by individuals who have experienced trauma. And most of all, it is an ongoing journey rather than a box to be checked. Despite these obstacles, we have seen incredible bravery, resilience, and strength from the LGBTQIA plus survivors we have had the privilege to support at GAIN. And I do think this is indicative of the community. In our 15-year history, we have seen many of our clients go on to help their communities as advocates. And I would be remiss if I didn't explain that there are people and organizations in our community, including nonprofits like the one where I work, as well as private immigration attorneys and victim service agencies who can help survivors to access these forms of relief and the social services they need to begin to heal. Our vision at GAIN is safety, freedom, and opportunity for all, and we believe that people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, and all of the people who identify as LGBTQIA+ deserve the same opportunity as everyone else. If you know an immigrant survivor in need of legal representation for their immigration case, GAIN may be able to help. We provide attorneys free of charge for qualifying immigrant survivors who can't afford a private attorney. So if you need assistance, please contact us at info@georgiaasylum.org or 678-335-6040. Thank you.